Edwin Edwards was actually investigated some 24 times. He had never been investigated before, never. In all his life, in public life, starting in 1954 all the way up to about 1972. And by the time he was taking the oath of office, there was a grand jury already investigating him. I mean, on the first day. Edwin Edwards is Louisiana's only 4-term governor. He was governor for 16 years, not consecutively. The state constitution only allows you to serve 2 consecutive terms. So he served in the 1970s from 72 to 80, and then again from 84 to 88, and his last term was 92 to 96. So he was a record setter just in years alone, and I think that the way that the political system is set up now, we'll probably never see that again.
What kind of a governor was he?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, and I talked to a lot of people about that, but I think on balance, he was probably one of the best, if not the best, administrator that Louisiana ever had as far as administrating state government. He had a very quick mind, and he could keep he knew what all 144 legislators were thinking, how they were voting, what their political persuasion was. He kept all that in his head. So consequently, he knew before they got to his office what it is that they wanted. And so he would have a ready answer for almost all of them. So he always knew, yes, what was politically expedient, but at the same time, he did move the state forward in that he was a fiscal conservative. So he forced the legislature every year, especially in the 70s, to balance the budget at the end of each year, not let it get out of control. And to that extent, he was able to also change the severance tax on oil and gas. And when he did that, he changed it from 25 cents a barrel on oil, for instance, to 12.5% of value at the time when OPEC really was beginning to take over the production and pricing of oil, and oil began to shoot up. So when he did that, tens of millions of dollars suddenly flowed into the state coffers. In fact, by the end of the 1970s, the headlines read, "We were suffering from an embarrassment of riches." Even the politicians couldn't figure out where to throw all the money. So by the late 1970s, we were the most cash-rich state in the nation. Louisiana was leading the nation as far as programs, highway construction, everything, at a time when New York City was on the brink of bankruptcy. So it got the eye of a lot of people. It got the eye of Ted Kennedy, for instance, when Ted Kennedy was basically trying to overthrow Jimmy Carter at the 1980 convention for the nomination, the Democratic nomination for president. And Kennedy through some friends, contacted Edwin Edwards to see if he would be interested in going on the ticket as VP in the hopes that maybe he could make some sense out of the federal budget and try to get America back on a position of balancing the budget year to year. So he became quite well known for that. Edwin Edwards was first indicted in 1985 in a federal indictment. And then he had the first Volts trial in 1985, and then there was a retrial in 1986. And he was acquitted in the second trial. Charges back then were he was supposed to be bid rigging hospital certificates. At that time, the federal government had a program to where in order to serve rural counties, rural parishes, rural areas, the federal government would, according to the states, how the states saw that they needed medical care out in the countryside, they would issue these certificates of need. And those certificates would wind up being very valuable because healthcare corporations would take those certificates, and then they would get federal money to help build these facilities. So it became very lucrative. Anyway, so he was charged with helping his friends out when he did that kind of thing. But the problem with that is that the final jury that acquitted him said, you know, these guys didn't do anything different than what any other business person would do. And the first trial, what happened with John Volts, who was appointed by Jimmy Carter, by the way, John Volts got Edwards on the witness stand, and he said, "Didn't you do this to enrich your family and friends?" And Edwards says, "Well, no, it's you know, that's, you know, you really help out your friends. That's true, but you help out everybody because that's what you're there to do." He said, "As a matter of fact, I remember, Mr. Volts, one time when you wanted, you called me up for some help." And John Volz stopped that line of questioning and took a whole nother turn. But there were other reporters that were in the gallery who followed up on that, and they found out that John Volz had actually called Edwin Edwards to try to get him to put pressure on the two ranking senators from Louisiana to put pressure on the Department of Justice to get him a federal judgeship. And so, and of course it didn't work. But it's funny that he was being accused of that. So the dynamic in the Volz trials was the federal judge overseeing the trial was the guy who had gotten the job, overseeing the guy who had wanted his job, prosecuting the guy that he had tried to use to get that job. So anyway, Volz went down in flames. And I was convinced that at that point, especially in 1986 when Edwards was acquitted, he came out on the courthouse steps and he railed against the federal government. He called them just about everything else in the book you could think of: the FBI, the federal prosecutor, the agents that were on the case, and he said far more than he should have. In fact, his wife, there's a famous picture of his wife putting her hand over his mouth. And so that was the beginning of the end for him. He had always been a smart aleck, and people in power don't like that. And so he always was very quick with a quip, very quick with a joke. I mean, he told in the '83 election that Dave Treen, his Republican opponent, is so slow that it takes him an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes. I mean, things like that. He should have been, he could have been a stand-up comedian. It could have been better than Hope and Seinfeld, this guy. But, then he gets to the David Duke race in 1991, and he says, David Duke, a reporter said, is there any place where you two possibly could be alike? Because you're ultra-liberal, he's ultra-conservative. Is there any place you could be alike? And he, without even thinking, he goes, yes, there is. We're both wizards under the sheets. I mean, not very many politicians get away with lines like that, but it made very good theater here for those of us in Louisiana and elsewhere. I mean, this guy's been profiled 3 times by 60 Minutes. So he always had something on the ball upstairs, but there was always that little sinister flow in there somewhere where people just, as time went on, didn't really trust him. And there was a lot of times when he probably could have defended himself, but he insisted that defending himself always made it worse. He saw people in other politicians and powerful people who were always trying to defend themselves against charges. And the reality is that the more they defended themselves, the worse off they became. So he would just pass it off with a joke and move on. He never was bothered by things like that. The second major indictments were the most recent ones where he was indicted for extortion. 26 counts, and he wound up being convicted on 17. And it was where he was supposed to be rigging riverboat licenses. And the story is, the truth of the story is that there was only one license left by the time he became governor for the 4th term, and that was the 15th riverboat license. Louisiana had mandated that only 15 riverboats could be in Louisiana, so the 15th license was still up for grabs. All the others had been distributed under Buddy Roemer. And so, so he was indicted, he was investigated and indicted for allegedly extorting money out of Eddie DeBartolo Jr., the owner of the San Francisco 49ers, to get that 15th license. Then let's see, there was Robert Guidry, who already owned a riverboat, and to keep his license, he allegedly was extorted. And then there was Ricky Shetler, who worked for Players Casino in Lake Charles, who said that he was extorted for keeping the Edwardses, meaning Edwards and his son, Stephen, from, I don't know, harming them in Lake Charles. Anyway, they never really believed it, and their testimony proved that to begin with. So, so the real charge came down to DeBartolo. DeBartolo and he had gotten together years before. DeBartolo's father built most of the malls in America, the Edward J. DeBartolo organization. Well, Eddie Jr., for his 30th birthday, his father gave him the San Francisco 49ers. So he lavished all kinds of money on the 49ers. In fact, Eddie DeBartolo is the reason for the salary cap that we have today in the NFL. But the NFL also had bylaws that said that you're not supposed to be associated with a gambling operation. Well, DeBartolo just bypassed that. He just ignored all that. So he comes to Louisiana and decides he wants to have a casino. So he begins to use Edwin Edwards to do all the legal work, to do all the paperwork for what it's going to take to get a casino. The only other spot left open was in Bossier Parish up in northwest Louisiana, up near Shreveport. And so DeBartolo and Edwards get together, but Edwards continues to send him retainer agreements. DeBartolo never signs them. DeBartolo never returns them. DeBartolo never pays him. But yet Edwards continues to go ahead and fill out everything he needs to fill out. In fact, Edwards puts him together with Hollywood casinos out of Dallas. And so they do a proposal that's far and away the best proposal of any of them that are on the table. So he knows he's going to win. Well, he goes to DeBartolo and he says, look, getting the license is the easy part. The hard part's going to be trying to sell it to the voters. So we need money, $250,000 to begin a TV blitz campaign up in northwest Louisiana so that people will vote for it, because it has to be passed by referendum. So DeBartolo says, well, you know, just do it right. Just blitz the whole thing. We'll give you $500,000. He says, I don't need $500,000. You know, we really only need about $250,000. And so he says, well, here, just take $400,000. I'll just go ahead and get you a check for $400,000. Well, DeBartolo never delivered. He never would deliver the check. And it's because he had a guy in his office who said, you need to stay away from the Edwardses because they're bad news. I don't want you associating with them. So DeBartolo forces Edwards to fly to San Francisco and pick up cash. So Edwards goes in and he picks up the cash. Well, of course, that instantly looks wrong. And Edwards knows that. And he was dumb for making that move. But the reality is that DeBartolo stayed on the defense team after the charges were filed. He stayed on the defense team right up until, and Eddie Jordan, the U.S. prosecutor out of New Orleans, and the assistant prosecutor, Jim Letton, go to the owner of the San Francisco 49ers and says, if we beat you in court, not only are you going to lose the 49ers, you're going to lose your fortune, and you're going to go spend a lot of time in prison. So are you sure your story's straight? And so DeBartolo flipped. And he comes back and he says, okay, now that $400,000 was extortion. So he flies here to Baton Rouge and he says, I was a victim. Now the FBI had recorded some 100, 200 conversations where DeBartolo had continually called Edwards and said, what do you hear? What do we need to do? We'll do whatever we need to do. Edwards had only initiated 3 of those calls. So it's really hard to balance out who is the real victim here based on that. When he was convicted of 17 counts in May of 2000, he goes to prison in October of 2002 and stays there for 8 years and 3 months. He got a 10-year sentence, which was double the prescription. At that time, they had prescriptions on sentences. And the federal judge, because he has that discretion, just doubled the sentence. So he could have gotten out in less than 5 years under the prescription, but he gave him a 10-year sentence, and so he got out in 8 years and 3 months. But he came out and he said, you know, they gave me life and I came back with a wife. I mean, he's just unsinkable. This guy is unsinkable. He's one of the greatest politicians of all time because he actually did do something as far as administering state business, and at the same time, he was great theater, and everybody likes their great theater. You know, they can only take facts and figures to a point. They just have to have a gut feeling of whether or not they actually like the leader, and Edwards was a master at that.
What made you to decide to write this book, and how long did it take you to put together?
Well, actually, Edwards came to me through a friend, and he said, "Do you, would you want to write my biography?" And I told the friend, I said, "You know something? I really don't want to write the biography because there's a lot about him I don't like. I covered him for the better part of 25 years, and he was always too much of a smart aleck for me, and I just didn't really like his politics." Backroom deals. I mean, all the stuff that you hear about, you think about, and so the friend said, "Well, it's nice to know that you're still an objective reporter, that you can see both sides of a story. And, you know, I said, well, you know what, I'll go over and talk to him just out of morbid curiosity. I'd love to just see what he's thinking. And so I went over and I talked to him, and we sort of struck an agreement that, you know, he would tell me what he thinks is the truth. And then I will go back and follow up by doing an incredible amount of research and tracking back down these leads and these stories. And indeed, at the end of 5 years, I had 2,000 pages and 3,000 footnotes. And so it took me 2 years just to cut it down to 621 pages. But I mean, I loved it. It was a lot of work. It was very tedious. I loved it though, because it really showed me the greater picture, not just a man's life in the picture, but it showed what created that life and what he created as a result of being part of that picture. I wish that everybody, if they really wanted to have an understanding of American politics, could go back and look at the players right now and tell who they are, where they came from. Because that'll give you an idea about sort of where we're headed. If you're a student of history, you can sometimes figure out the direction of where things are going to, how everything's going to finish. And right now it doesn't look too good.
Did your perception of him change after writing this book?
It did to an extent. It didn't completely change. I still like to believe that I held my objectivity as far as possible. Yes, I did like him as a person. I mean, when you're spending 5 years with somebody every week or so, then you do develop a sympathy. But that's the temptation of all biographers, to develop a sympathy for the person you're writing about. And he did have good reasons for doing some of the things that he did. But the other part to that is what every person who ever aspires to and grabs a high office, and that is the power that goes along with it, does compromise a person. I don't care how strong they are morally, it just does, because people look at you and they project that power onto you, and the ego begins to feed into that, and before long, a person at the extreme end of that feels like they're above the laws, such as a President Richard Nixon. When you start to look at it in that perspective, I don't care how strong you are, how strong of moral fiber you think you are. When there's enough money and power heaped on you, it will change you, unless you quit while you're ahead. And most politicians cannot do that. They cannot walk away from it.
What's Edwin Edwards doing now?
Edwin Edwards is 84 years old, enjoying his life. He has a wife who is 51 years his junior. He says that he's as incorrigible as ever, and he says that that a man is only as old as the woman he feels. I mean, he just keeps going. I mean, this guy is unsinkable. And he knows that he's going to die one day, and he says, I've had more good luck than most people have had, and I've had more good luck than I deserve. So spending 8 years in prison for me was really a very small price to pay. And did he finish out being a multimillionaire? Not what I've seen. So I can't really say he stole the bank or stole the treasury. And he says that is one of the few things he was never accused of, is he never took any money from the taxpayer. But his trial back in 2000 was questionable. I mean, it was. I spelled that out. I didn't cover the trial, so for me to go back through the record, to go back and see how the reporters inside the courtroom covered it, how the pundits and the policymakers and some of the public opinion people that form public opinion in newspapers, and some of the, how they all wrote about it. Everybody was beginning to throw flags and saying, wait a minute, is this America? I mean, can you really prosecute somebody like this and use testimony that's supposed to be secret from another a grand jury, a state grand jury? And I mean, there were just all kinds of legal corners that were cut. But it showed you that they were bound and determined to finally get Edwin Edwards. And they did. So but he survived it, and now he's in his RV traveling the country.